Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm here to talk about UNHCR's release of the Global Trends Report, which we released this morning. And again, it's a year of another dismal picture of forced displacement globally. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the situation overall, then consider the particular trends that we noticed from 2017, and finally speak a little bit about where we hope to go in the future, given the very dismal picture that we're faced with at present. In regard to the levels, we saw an increase in forced displacement again for the sixth straight year. We have 68.5 million people now who are forcibly displaced from their homes. That represents 28.3 million refugees and some 40 million persons who were displaced within their own countries. This is 50% higher than just 10 years ago. So while we see lots of progress in the world today on many, many fronts, this is one area where we're not seeing any progress at all. In fact, the situation seems to be getting worse. And of course, the reasons are clear. It's because of unrelenting and unremitting conflict that is not being resolved and causing people to flee their homes. The largest source countries of persons who are forcibly displaced are Syria, Colombia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Afghanistan. The frequency is rather alarming. 44,000 persons every day in 2017 were forced from their homes, and many forced to flee far from where they started. That represents one person every 2 seconds. So how do you convey really adequately the scale of this? If it were a country, it would be the 21st most populous country in the entire world. And if you read the headlines in the West, you would think this is a problem that is of most urgent consequence and impact on the West. And yet, in fact, it's not, because 2/3 of persons who are forcibly displaced are displaced in low-income and middle-income countries. If we look to the specifics of last year, we see that there were 16.2 million newly displaced persons. That represents 11 million persons who were displaced within their own countries and 4 million refugees and asylum seekers. 1/3 of the refugees came from South Sudan alone. Refugee origins, countries that produce the most refugees in the world today, 2/3 are coming from just 5 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. So if we could resolve the causes that force these people to move in just these 5 countries, we would see a dramatic reduction in refugee numbers overall. In terms of persons who are internally displaced, in Colombia, there's over 7 million persons who are internally displaced, followed by Syria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Yemen, and South Sudan. The statistics on children are also quite revealing. For the first time this year, UNHCR has published the number of unaccompanied or separated children that are registered with us. We know that over close to half the number of persons who are displaced in the world today are children. And in terms of those who travel without their parents or without a guardian, we registered last year 173,000 children. And these are children that aren't just going to another city or another neighborhood. They're crossing an international boundary in some of the most difficult and dangerous circumstances that we see around the world. They're crossing mountains and going through deserts at the hands of smugglers, often prey to traffickers. They're subject to all sorts of risks and abuse. And the kind of trauma that has propelled these children to have to leave and separated from their families is therefore magnified by what they encounter en route. In regard to solutions, it's again another rather depressing year. We saw less than 670,000 refugees return home, and those that did return home often returned to situations of instability or insecurity where there was a risk of conflict or conflict was ongoing, so the sustainability of return remains in doubt. We had only 102,000 refugees resettled last year. This was a reduction of close to 46% from the year before. Refugee resettlement has never provided a solution to the number of people who we feel are in need of it. We estimate that 10% of all refugees have acute needs that really must be addressed by resettling to a third country. And yet last year we were only able to secure that solution for less than 1%. In regard to internally displaced persons, 4 million people did return home, but again, if you look at the situations in which they were returned, many also were to very insecure areas. So where do we go with all of this? We see humanitarian budgets that aren't nearly enough to meet global need. We see ongoing conflict and rising displacement. And that means that we are left to cope with the situation of forcibly displaced persons, most of them who are living in communities who are also very badly off. So we need a new means to go about addressing this. And in 2016, the General Assembly decided that they endorsed a comprehensive response mechanism for large movements of refugees in the New York Declaration. And that comprehensive response mechanism has been applied now in 14 countries. And what precisely is it? It is a mechanism that says this is not just about providing humanitarian relief to refugees. It means we need development assistance to communities that are supporting refugees, but also to invest in refugees themselves so they are able to contribute to those communities. And we need a much broader array of stakeholders than traditionally we've used in the past. We need to go beyond traditional donors. We need to seek development in humanitarian agencies, international financial institutions, private sector, NGOs, civil society, faith-based groups, community-based organizations, refugees themselves. And that approach is gaining traction, and it is being further embedded in a global compact for refugees that we're now discussing with member states, and we hope to have adopted in November this year. And what that will do is hopefully bring more predictable and a broader response to help refugees not just survive, but try to help them thrive in the areas of displacement, while at the same time providing very needed support to the communities within which they've found safety. It is not a panacea. It is not a solution to forced displacement, but it is a window going forward as to how we can manage the situation given the present realities that we're currently living in.
Okay, we will now take questions. Any questions? Yes, Matthew.
Sure. Thanks a lot, and thanks for this briefing. I was just reading the report, and I wanted to ask you something about it. It has a section on unaccompanied children, separated and unaccompanied children, and the way it was phrased, I couldn't figure out. It talked about a number. I'm trying to pull up the page, but it talked about a number of approximately 8,000. In Cameroon. I didn't know, or it linked this number with Cameroon, and I wasn't sure whether this, from the way it was written, whether this was a reference to CAR and Nigerian refugees in Cameroon or Cameroon refugees in Nigeria. And I wanted to, on the latter point, I wanted to ask you, I know it came up in a press conference they held in Abuja, what is the number of Cameroonians fleeing into Nigeria from what's perceived as a crackdown in the Anglophone areas of Cameroon? Is it rising, and what's the UNHCR's plan to deal with it, particularly in light of some of the refoulement that has taken place of high-profile people who fled seeking asylum and, in fact, apparently were registered as refugees and were forcibly returned to Cameroon? Can you speak to that issue? Thank you.
On the actual breakdown of the number 8,000 unaccompanied minors that you're referring to, Matthew, I can't. I mean, I'd have to look at the report, and we'd have to see whether that's our registration figures inside Cameroon or whether or not it's referring to the source country of the unaccompanied minors. But that's a question we can revert back to you on. I can tell you this about any situation of refoulement. It's something that we don't sit back on and let happen. It's always one, regardless of where it happens in the world, that we take up very clearly with countries. This is not the first situation that UNHCR would have been confronted with, nor in 2017 or even in 2018. And what we say is that it's absolutely imperative that the right to seek and receive asylum is respected by countries, and that people are not refouled, which is, as you know, not just a question of international refugee law, but international law. Beyond that, on the specifics of the exact cases in Cameroon, I can't speak to at the moment.
Just, if you don't mind, I found the page. This is because maybe we can just it says, quote, other countries with high numbers of unaccompanied and separated child refugees reported included Cameroon, 8,600, South Sudan, 6,600. And that's what I mean. I
Yeah,
guess I'm
that's
saying,
referring to our number of registered refugees inside that country.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
so
it-
refugees from other countries. The national breakdown, we'd have to get back to you.
And just in the case of I mean, I know that there's refoulement of people are pushed back en masse, and you don't know what really happens to them. In the case that I'm asking you about, it was 47 people, and none of them have been seen publicly since they were sent back. So they were apparently sent back to either be imprisoned or worse. And I'm just wondering what follow-through is there it's one thing to say we're deeply concerned, but has there been any attempt to follow through on the sort of the fruits of refoulement, which in this case involved basically forced disappearance?
Well, on that specific case with respect to that specific country, we'd have to go to our country offices and provide you with. I don't want to speculate
Yeah.
here. I mean, I can assure you that we don't sit back and say, well, that's too bad. We take immediate action. And some of that action is action that we can make public, and some of it is action that, for obvious reasons, we don't.
Yes.
Thank you, Prudence Aropane from News Agency of Nigeria. There have been times when UNHCR cautioned Cameroon against forced displacement of, forced eviction of Nigerian refugees in Cameroon. So I want to ask, do you have a record of Nigerian refugees that are still in Cameroon right now?
In terms of the precise details of Nigerian refugees in Cameroon,
absolutely.
I'd have to refer you to our office in Cameroon. I wouldn't have that right at the top of my head. But we can get back to you on that.
Then there's this recent declaration by the Nigerian government that the internally displaced persons should return back, to their communities. And we have seen Boko Haram still attacking some of these communities. Did you share, the Nigerians' views that these IDPs should return back to their communities, or you have a different perspective?
Again, on the specifics of that, we'd have to send you to our office. But I can tell you this, in terms of returns generally, we're of the view that there needs to be situation in the return area that will sustain those returns. And certainly premature returns is not helpful to anyone, to the returnees, nor to the country in which or the area in which they're going, because it can lead to further displacement. But with respect to the precise areas that you're talking about, I'd be better to refer you to the persons who are closer to that issue than I am here in New York.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Sure. This is actually, I think this will be right in your wheelhouse. I just wanted to know, in looking and trying to find the report, I went to the multimedia page, and this is just a strange question. I noticed that the report so far is, at least as it appears, is in English and Spanish, and the press releases are in English, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and Arabic. And I just wonder, am I missing something? Is there a Chinese and Russian site elsewhere? Or how do you choose? I guess I'm just used to the Security Council where there's like 6 languages. Sometimes there might be Portuguese or maybe German sometimes. But what does this reflect? Is there some other site, or is the launch really directed? It looks like, it looks very heavy on the European and obviously Latin American side. Are you aware of this? I mean, I'm just wondering. I don't know what country office to go to ask this one, so I'm just looking at the list.
All I can say to you is really I don't know what the protocol is in terms of how fast we get out our launch in different countries in different languages around the world, or even cover the regions. But that's an easy question we can revert back on.
All right.
Yes, please.
People Canora with Chicken Online in India. In your report, I don't have a copy of it, but it has been mentioned that 3 million people are displaced, and solutions are within reach. Could you elaborate on that? Solutions are within reach.
I don't know precisely what line you're referring to in the report, but I can tell you this, that in some situations, it depends on the context, solutions don't seem to be closely at hand. And these are the areas that I mentioned which have seen unremitting conflict and ongoing displacement for many years. If you look at the refugee numbers themselves, the vast majority of refugees have been outside their countries for over 5 years and are in a state of protracted displacement. But I think what you're referring to is the aspirational view that speaks to two things. One is that if there is political commitment to resolve the conflicts that we see in the world today, we could bring solutions to bear. And secondly, that while we wait for that to happen, we do have the promise of the Global Compact for Refugee, which should bring much needed support and a more predictable means of support for countries that are hosting the vast majority of refugees, but as well help to invest in the human capital and the abilities of refugees, not only so they can contribute to the communities in which they currently reside, but also to help them rebuild the communities to which we hope they will eventually return once peace is restored in their country of origin.
Any more questions? You have one more question? No, you're fine. Okay. Any more questions from anyone? Okay, thank you very much.